Georgia Bancroft slammed the jar of flour onto the bar so hard that the amber lamplight shivered in every glass along the shelf. "Tell them, Cyrus," she said, loud enough that the piano player's hands stilled over the keys and every head in the Golden Nugget Saloon turned toward the counter. "Tell them what is in this sack you sold to the mayor's family last week. Tell them what killed their boy." Cyrus Whitfield did not flinch. He was a broad, silver-whiskered man in a black coat too fine for a mining town, and he had built his reputation the way he built everything else in Larkspur Flat, one careful brick at a time, until people forgot to ask what the mortar was made of. "Miss Bancroft," he said, setting down his glass with the patience of a man humoring a child, "grief makes a person say wild things. I am sorry for the mayor's boy. Truly. But accusing a man of poisoning children in front of half the town is a serious matter, and you are not a doctor. You pour whiskey for a living." "I have poured whiskey and set bones and pulled fever from grown men since the day my father died in this town with no one to replace him," Georgia said, her voice not rising, though her hands were shaking with the effort of keeping it level. "I have also read the newspapers from Sacramento describing plaster of Paris cut into flour to stretch a short shipment. I have seen the boy's stomach, Cyrus. I have seen what a family eats when your mercantile is the only one for 30 miles. A murmur went through the room like wind through dry grass. Somewhere near the door, boots scraped against the floorboards, and a stranger stepped half into the light, one shoulder pressed against the frame as though the wall alone was keeping him upright. He was tall, dark-haired beneath a hat gone gray with trail dust, and there was a dark stain spreading along his left side that no one in the room had noticed yet but Georgia, whose eyes went to wounds the way other women's eyes went to rings on a hand. "She is not wrong about the flour," the stranger said, his voice rough but steady. "I have seen a man cut corn meal with plaster in Sonora and sell it to families who could not afford to complain. Different name on the sign, same hand doing the arithmetic." Every eye in the room swung to him instead, which seemed to be exactly what Cyrus Whitfield wanted, because his face relaxed into something like relief. "And who," Whitfield said smoothly, "might you be to walk into my town and vouch for a woman slandering me?" The stranger opened his mouth to answer, and that was when his knees buckled. Georgia was around the bar before she had decided to move, catching him under the arm with a strength that surprised the men nearest her, easing him down onto a bench rather than letting him crash to the floor. Her fingers went to his side, found the wet warmth soaking through his shirt, and her mind emptied of everything except the old, familiar litany her father had drilled into her. Pressure first, panic never. "Somebody bring my bag from the back room," she said, not to anyone in particular, and someone went. It was in the commotion of that moment, with George's palm pressed hard against a stranger's bleeding ribs and the whole saloon crowding closer to see, that the door banged open again and Sheriff Thomas Bancroft walked in with a folded paper in his hand and an expression on his face like a man who had just been handed a debt he did not order. "Georgia," he said, "step back from him. He is bleeding, Thomas. He is wanted." Thomas held up the paper so the lamplight fell across it, and even upside-down Georgia could read the bold print well enough. "Wanted for murder and robbery. WALLACE $500 reward, Angels Bend, CALAVERAS County." Bounty Rider came through an hour ago asking after him. Description matches to the letter. The stranger, Wallace Barnett, if the paper spoke true, let his head fall back against the wall and laughed, a short, exhausted sound with no humor in it at all. "Of course it does," he said. "It was drawn up to match." Cyrus Whitfield's mouth had gone very still, and Georgia, even with her hands full of another man's blood, did not miss it. Thomas Bancroft was not a cruel man, and Georgia loved her brother the way she loved few things left to her in this world. But she had watched him take Cyrus Whitfield's money 3 years running to keep his badge, and she knew exactly which way he would lean unless someone gave him a reason not to. "He needs a surgeon before he needs a cell," she said, meeting her brother's eyes. You can hang a healthy man just as easily as a dying one, Thomas, and it will look a great deal better for you if he is standing when the circuit judge asks him to answer for himself." It took her brother a long moment, but he nodded, and the crowd exhaled as one animal releasing a held breath. They carried Wallace Barnett to the jailhouse rather than the saloon's back room, at Thomas's insistence, and Georgia followed with her bag because no one in Larkspur Flat, wanted man or not, was going to die on her watch from a bullet wound she could close. The cell in the Larkspur Flat jailhouse was not built for doctoring, but Georgia had worked in worse places, on kitchen tables and wagon beds, and once, memorably, on the floor of a church during a flash flood. She knelt beside the cot Thomas had dragged in and cut away Wallace Barnett's shirt with the small scissors she kept for exactly this purpose, and she did not look up when she spoke. "You said the poster was drawn up to match you," she said. "That is a strange thing to say about your own crime." "It is not my crime." His voice was tight around the pain but clear enough. "I was sheriff in Angel's Bend for 4 years. Elected fair, though I will admit the money behind that election came from men who expected favors back." George's hands paused for half a second over the wound before continuing their work. "Whitfield's kind of men. His exact kind. His actual money, in fact, though it took me the better part of a year investigating my own town's assay office to understand that," he hissed as she probed the wound with a clean cloth. "There is a stamp mill in Angel's Bend that processes ore from 6 different claims. I found short weights on the certificates, gold going missing between the scale and the ledger, a little at a time, spread thin enough that no single miner could prove he was robbed. And someone did not want that found. Nathaniel Cole did the actual skimming. He was the assier, and I believe at first he thought it was a small enough theft to live with. Then his conscience got the better of him, and he came to me wanting to confess, wanting protection for his family in trade for testimony against the man who had ordered it. 3 days later he was dead in an alley with my hunting knife in his chest, a knife I had reported stolen a week before, and 2 witnesses who swore they saw me arguing with him that same night. Witnesses who were paid. Witnesses who worked in a stamp mill owned by a very generous man. Wallace looked at her then, and despite the gray pallor of blood loss there was something steady in his eyes that made her believe him before she had decided to. I ran because I would not have lived to stand trial. I have spent a year moving through these hills trying to find a federal marshal or a judge who does not eat supper at Whitfield tables. I did not know Cyrus Whitfield had holdings this far south until I heard his name shouted across a saloon tonight. Georgia sat back on her heels, her bloodied hands resting on her knees, and for a moment the only sound in the cell was his ragged breathing and the tick of the stove cooling in the front room. "That is either the truth," she said slowly, "or the most convincing lie I have heard since I stopped believing men who tell me whiskey never killed anybody. I would not blame you for thinking the second. I did not say I thought the second." She reached for her needle and thread, sterilized in the whiskey Thomas kept for exactly this purpose, though he would never admit to keeping it for medicine. "Hold still. This is going to hurt considerably more than talking has." He held still, jaw tight, while she closed the wound with the neat, economical stitches her father had taught her on chicken skin before he ever led her near a living patient. And when she tied off the last one and sat back to survey her work, Wallace Barnett let out a long breath that was almost, though not quite, a laugh. "You have a gentle hand for a woman who slammed a jar of flour hard enough to crack it." The jar did not crack. She began packing away her instruments. "And I have had a great deal of practice being gentle with wounds and considerably less practice being gentle with liars, so you will forgive me if the second skill is rustier. I would rather you keep it rusty a while longer if it is all the same to you." Georgia looked up and found him watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was working its way toward one despite the pain, and something in her chest gave an unfamiliar little lurch that she chose, firmly, to ignore. Thomas Bancroft stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, having clearly heard enough of the exchange to make his face go careful and unreadable. "The circuit judge is not due through Larkspur Flat for another 6 weeks," he said. "Whitfield will not wait 6 weeks to see this man hanged, poster or no poster, because a hanging would end certain questions rather permanently. There is a fairer judge who sits regular in Placerville. I mean to have him transferred there for proper trial, soon as he can sit a horse." "Placerville is 2 days' ride in good weather," Georgia said. "It is late spring. The weather has not been good in a month." "I am aware of the season, Georgia." "Then you are aware Whitfield has men who would gladly make sure a prisoner never arrived to inconvenience him with a trial at all." She stood, wiping her hands on a cloth, and met her brother's eyes with the same steadiness she had used on him since they were children, and she was the one who patched his scraped knees. "He needs a physician on that ride, Thomas, in case those stitches tear open on the trail, and you need someone riding with your deputy whose word Whitfield cannot buy." Thomas's jaw worked for a moment. "You are asking to escort a wanted murderer across 2 counties." "I am asking to escort a wounded patient," Georgia said, "and to see for myself whether the evidence against Cyrus Whitfield's mercantile has anything at all to do with the evidence he claims to have against this man. If I am wrong about Wallace Barnett, Thomas, you will have your prisoner delivered safely, and I will have satisfied my own curiosity for nothing. If I am right, you will thank me for coming." Her brother looked at her a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that Georgia could not quite name, tired and wary, and underneath it, something that looked almost like fear, though whether it was fear for her or fear of Whitfield she could not have said. "Deputy Hollis rides with you," he said finally. "You leave at first light, before word gets further round town than it already has. And Georgia," he caught her arm as she turned to gather her things, "be careful who you decide to believe out there. Wanting a thing to be true does not make it so. I know that better than most men in this town, Thomas," she said quietly, "seeing as I have spent 3 years watching you take Whitfield's money and calling it politics because I wanted to believe you were still the brother I remembered." She left before he could answer, and if her words had landed somewhere tender, she told herself she did not have time just then to feel sorry about it. They left Larkspur Flat before the sun had cleared the ridgeline, 4 horses moving single file through wildflowers so thick along the trail that the meadow looked stitched in yellow and purple thread, lupin and poppy, and something Georgia's mother used to call shooting stars, though she had died before she could teach Georgia the proper name. Wallace Barnett rode with his wrists bound loosely in front of him rather than behind. A small mercy Thomas had allowed on Georgia's insistence that a man could not catch himself in a fall with his hands tied at his back, and Deputy Jed Hollis rode close beside him with a shotgun resting across his saddle, young and nervous, and clearly aware that he had drawn the sort of duty that made a man's career or ended it. "You are quiet for a man riding toward his own trial," Georgia said, drawing her horse alongside his an hour into the ride, when the meadow had given way to pine and the trail had narrowed enough that Hollis fell back a length behind them. "I have found that trials tend to go poorly for men who talk too much beforehand." Wallace glanced sideways at her, and despite the strain around his eyes, there was a dry humor in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he faced hard things. "Also, my side hurts considerably, and talking uses muscles a gunshot wound does not appreciate being used. You managed a full accounting of Angel's Bend corruption last night without complaint." "Last night I was trying to convince the woman holding a needle over my ribs that I was worth stitching up rather than left to bleed. Motivation clarifies a man's speech wonderfully." Georgia felt the corner of her mouth twitch despite herself. "And this morning you have decided I am already convinced, so you may rest your voice. This morning I have decided that a woman who runs a saloon, sets bones, delivers babies, and publicly accuses the richest man in 3 counties of poisoning children is not a woman easily convinced of anything she has not examined from every angle first. I expect you have been turning my story over all night looking for the seams." "I have," she admitted, I have not found any yet. That troubles me more than finding some wood. Why is that? Because a story with no seams is either entirely true, Georgia said, or told by a man skilled enough at lying that the seams are hidden too well for me to see. I have been wrong about men before, Mr. Barnett. I am careful about being wrong twice. Something in her tone made him look at her more closely, and though she kept her eyes forward on the trail, she felt his attention like warmth against the side of her face. "Someone hurt you," he said, not quite a question. "Someone lied to me," she said, "about something that mattered, and I trusted the lie because the man telling it had a respectable coat and a respectable smile, much like your Cyrus Whitfield, and I have not trusted respectable coats since. If you are wondering why I am the one riding beside a wanted man rather than my brother, that is your answer. Thomas trusts easily. I no longer have that luxury." Wallace was quiet for a moment, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a jay somewhere in the pines. "For what it is worth," he said finally, "I am glad it is you riding beside me and not your brother. I do not think your brother would have laughed at my joke about the needle." "I did not laugh. You smiled. In the lamplight last night, right before you told me to hold still, I saw it." Georgia did not answer that, mostly because she was afraid of what her voice might do if she tried, and they rode on in a silence that had somehow, without her quite noticing the change, become almost comfortable. The ambush came at midday, where the trail crossed a shallow creek bed lined with alder, and Georgia would spend a long time afterward being grateful that Deputy Hollis had good ears, because it was his shout of warning that gave them the half-second needed to scatter rather than ride straight into the guns. Two riders broke from the alder with pistols already drawn, and Georgia's horse reared as a shot cracked past close enough to stir her hair, and then everything became noise and motion. Hollis firing back with his shotgun, Wallace's horse bolting sideways as he fought to control it with bound hands, and Georgia throwing herself flat along her mare's neck the way her father had taught her, when a spooked horse was safer than an exposed rider. It was over in less than a minute. One of the attackers went down with a shoulder wound from Hollis's shotgun, and his companion dragged him up onto a horse and fled back into the trees rather than press an advantage that had clearly cost more than expected, and the sudden quiet afterward felt louder than the gunfire had. "Hollis," Georgia called, already turning her horse. "Are you hit?" "No, ma'am. Grazed my hat is all." He was pale but steady, reloading with hands that shook only a little. "That was no bandit trying his luck, Miss Bancroft. Bandits do not know to wait at a creek crossing on this particular trail on this particular day." "No," Georgia agreed grimly, "they do not." She looked to Wallace, who had gotten his horse back under control and sat with his bound hands pressed hard against his side, blood beginning to show again through his shirt. "You have torn your stitches." "I have had worse mornings," he said, though his voice was tight with pain, "though I confess I am struggling to recall when." Hollis insisted on riding ahead to scout the trail before they moved further, leaving Georgia alone with Wallace beside the creek, while she redid the stitches he had torn, her hands steady out of long habit even as her mind raced through the uncomfortable arithmetic of the ambush. Whitfield's men, sent ahead of them somehow, though they had left Larkspur Flat before dawn. Someone had known their route before they rode it. "Someone in town told him," she said quietly, working the needle through torn skin while Wallace held himself rigid against the pain. "Whitfield knew which trail we would take before we knew it ourselves. Your brother's office is not so large that a man cannot hear plans made in it from the street," Wallace said. "It does not mean your brother told him." "I know that." She tied off the stitch harder than strictly necessary, and he winced. "I am not accusing Thomas. I am saying that a man who can hear plans made in a sheriff's office holds more power in this county than any sheriff, elected or not, and that frightens me considerably more than being shot at, because being shot at ends, and that kind of power does not." They made camp that night in a stand of pines well off the main trail, Hollis insisting on first watch despite George's protests that he had earned rest more than either of them, and it was well past midnight with Holly's soft snoring rising from his bedroll, and the fire burned down to embers, that Georgia found herself sitting across from Wallace, unable to sleep, both of them wrapped against the cold spring air that came down off the Sierra even in late May. "You are thinking too loud," Wallace said, not opening his eyes. "I can hear it from here." "I am thinking about the ledger," Georgia said. "You mentioned a ledger back in Angel's Bend that Nathaniel Cole kept. Do you know what became of it?" Wallace opened his eyes then and looked at her across the dying fire, and something in his face shifted, weighing whether to trust her with the rest of it. "I have a page of it," he admitted finally, "sewn into the lining of my saddlebag. I took it the night I ran, before they could burn what remained of his office. It is not the whole ledger, only enough to show the pattern of short waits across 6 months, in Cole's own hand, dated and initialed the way an honest bookkeeper keeps records even when the books themselves are dishonest. I have been trying to reach a federal marshal in Sacramento for the better part of a year to put it in hands Whitfield cannot reach, but every road toward Sacramento seems to run through a town where his name means something. May I see it?" He hesitated only a moment before nodding toward his saddlebag, and Georgia retrieved it carefully, working loose the stitching along the lining with the same patient fingers she used on wounds, until a single folded page came free, soft with handling and creased along old lines. By the low light of the embers she read columns of figures in a careful, cramped hand, dates running from the previous autumn through winter, weights recorded against weights paid out, the discrepancies small individually but damning in their consistency, and at the bottom in different ink as though added later in a shaking hand, a single line: "I cannot keep silent on this any longer, whatever it costs me. God forgive me for the year I already have." Georgia sat very still for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers, not from the cold. "This is the same hand," she said slowly, "as the mercantile ledger Whitfield's clerk showed me 2 months ago, when he was drunk enough to feel guilty and sober enough to still be frightened of losing his position. The clerk's name is Amos Prout. He kept records of flour shipments that never quite matched what left the wagons, and when I pressed him, he said the numbers came from a man who used to work the assay office up in Calaveras County before Whitfield brought him south to keep his mercantile books instead." Wallace's breath caught. Cole worked 2 positions, Asser in Angel's Bend, and before that, mercantile clerk somewhere south. Whitfield moved him. "Whitfield trained him," Georgia said, the pieces settling into place with the terrible clarity of a diagnosis finally understood, "in one town, and moved him to another to work the same theft on a different set of victims, because a pattern repeated in one place draws suspicion, but a pattern spread across 3 counties, worked by different hands in different years, looks like nothing but bad luck to anyone not looking for the seam." "And when Cole's conscience finally broke him," Wallace said quietly, "Whitfield could not simply dismiss him. A dismissed clerk might talk out of spite. A dead one, blamed on a meddling sheriff, could not talk at all." They looked at each other across the fire, and Georgia felt the last of her careful doubt give way, not to blind trust but to the clean, hard certainty of evidence that fit together without forcing. "I believe you," she said simply. "I want you to know that plainly, since I was not plain about it before. I believe every word you told me last night, and I intend to help you prove it, whatever that costs either of us." Wallace's throat worked, and for a moment he seemed unable to find words at all. "Why," he said finally, "would you take that risk for a stranger you met bleeding on your brother's floor not a day past?" "Because my father died in that town believing decent people simply had bad luck with fevers and bad harvests, when I have come to suspect at least some of that bad luck was manufactured by men in fine coats who never once dirtied their own hands." Georgia folded the ledger page carefully and pressed it back into his palm rather than her own, a decision she made deliberately, an offering of trust. "And because I am tired, Mr. Barnett, of watching my brother be a good man who does small cowardly things, because he is afraid of losing what little he has built. I would rather be afraid alongside someone brave than safe alongside someone who has stopped trying. Wallace closed his fingers around the paper and around her hand as it lingered a moment too long against his palm, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as good sense might have suggested. "Georgia Bancroft," he said, her name unfamiliar and warm in his mouth. "I do not know what I did in this life to deserve riding into a saloon bleeding and finding you on the other side of it, but I find myself considerably less sorry about the bullet than a sensible man ought to be." "Do not thank the bullet yet," she said, though her voice had gone softer than she intended. "We have a river to cross tomorrow, and I have heard the bridge at Willow Crossing has not been the same since the March floods." The bridge at Willow Crossing had, in fact, not been the same since the March floods, a fact that became apparent to all four travelers, Georgia's small party having been joined that morning by a farm family named Alvarez traveling the same road with a wagon of seed grain, well before they reached the crossing itself, when they came around a bend in the trail and found perhaps a dozen people already gathered on the near bank, staring at a bridge that sagged in its middle like a sway-backed mule. The Cosumnes River ran high and brown with snowmelt below them, fast enough that no sane horse would attempt to ford it, and the toll bridge that ordinarily spanned the gap had lost two of its central support pilings to the flood, leaving the planking bowed dangerously over open water and the far railing torn away entirely. "We have been stuck here since yesterday morning," said a heavy-set man who introduced himself as Cyrus's own bridge toll-keeper, a detail that made George's jaw tighten before he even finished his sentence. "Whitfield Freight Company owns this crossing, and word sent to Larkspur Flat for repair, timber has not brought so much as a plank back yet." "How long since the request went out?" Wallace asked, swinging down from his horse with careful movements that favored his stitched side. "3 days now. And no word at all." "None." Georgia exchanged a look with Wallace that needed no words. A man who could send riders ahead of them to ambush a creek crossing could certainly delay lumber meant to fix a bridge, if delaying that bridge happened to strand a party he badly wanted stopped somewhere with no easy way forward and no easy way back. Deputy Holly studied the sagging structure with a professional eye. "It is not beyond repair," he said slowly. "2 pilings gone, but the bank timber looks sound, and there is a stand of young pine not 50 yards back we could fell for temporary supports. It would want ropes, though, and more hands than we have among us." "We have hands," said Mr. Alvarez, the farmer, stepping forward with his sons flanking him, sturdy young men of perhaps 16 and 18 who had clearly spent their lives working land that did not forgive laziness. "We have been sitting here 2 days already with seed grain that will not plant itself. I would rather work than wait on a company that has already shown it does not care whether we wait or not." By mid-afternoon, the bank had become a construction site of sorts. Men and women alike hauling felled pine trunks down to the water's edge, while Georgia organized what amounted to a field hospital under a spreading oak, ready for the inevitable crushed fingers and wrenched backs such work produced. Wallace, despite George's firm instructions that he was not to strain his stitches, had made himself useful directing the placement of support timbers, drawing on some knowledge of engineering that Georgia suspected came from more than 4 years as a small-town sheriff. "You have done this before," she observed, bringing him water during a brief pause in the work. "Angel's Bend flooded twice in my time there," he said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold air. "A sheriff in a mining town does considerably more than arrest drunks, Georgia. I have built bridges, mediated claim disputes, once delivered a baby when the midwife was 3 days' ride away and the mother could not wait. It is not so different from doctoring in some respects. You learn to do what needs doing because no one else is coming to do it for you." "That," Georgia said, "may be the first thing you have told me that makes me trust you more than the ledger did." He smiled at that, tired and genuine, and something passed between them warmer than the spring sun overhead. The rain began an hour before sunset, cold and sudden the way spring storms came down off the Sierra, turning the riverbank to mud and the work to misery. But by then the new pilings were seated and lashed with rope, and Deputy Hollies, soaked to the skin, called out that the bridge would hold weight if they crossed carefully and one wagon at a time. It was as the Alvarez wagon made its slow, creaking way across the repaired span, every soul on the bank holding their breath, that riders appeared on the far bank, 3 of them, and Georgia recognized among them the broad shoulders of the man who had led the creek ambush, his arm now bound in a rough sling. "That is far enough," Wallace said, stepping forward with a borrowed rifle he had somehow acquired from Hollies during the day's work, positioning himself between the riders and the bridge with a calm that Georgia found herself admiring even through her fear. "The bridge is not built to hold a fight on it, and I expect none of us want to explain to Cyrus Whitfield why his crossing collapsed under gunfire meant for me." The lead rider, a lean man with cold eyes that Georgia would later learn belonged to Silas Crane, Whitfield's most trusted enforcer, studied the assembled crowd on the near bank, farmers and travelers and a deputy with a shotgun and a doctor with her chin lifted in open defiance, and seemed to calculate correctly that a dozen witnesses were considerably more than his employer had bargained for. "This is not finished, Barnett," Crane called across the water. "No," Wallace agreed, "it is not. But it will finish in a courtroom, Crane, not on a bridge in front of witnesses who will remember your face at trial. You may tell Whitfield that." The riders held a long moment, then wheeled and vanished back into the trees, and the crowd on the bank let out a ragged cheer that had more relief in it than triumph, and Georgia found herself laughing, half from nerves and half from something like joy, as Wallace lowered the rifle and turned back toward her with rain running down his face. "You are getting a reputation," she called to him over the rush of the swollen river, "for standing in doorways looking heroic while bleeding." "It is a poor career," he called back, "but the doctoring has been excellent." They crossed the bridge themselves an hour later, once every wagon and every soul on the bank had gone before them out of a shared, unspoken agreement that the doctor and the deputy ought to see everyone else safely across first. And it was on the far bank, in the gathering dark with the Alvarez family already making camp and Hollies gone to check on the horses, that Georgia found herself standing close beside Wallace, both of them soaked and exhausted and strangely, giddily alive. "I have known you 2 days," she said quietly, "and I have already watched you bleed twice and threaten a hired gun with a borrowed rifle. I confess I am beginning to wonder what I have got myself into, Wallace Barnett." "I could say the same," he said, "of a woman who slammed a jar of flour hard enough to rattle glasses across a room, then rode 2 days into danger to help a stranger she had every reason to distrust." He reached out, hesitant, and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I have spent a year running from everyone I meet, Georgia, because trust has cost me everything I once had. I find I do not know how to run from you. I am not certain I want to learn." "Then do not," she said softly, and when he leaned down to kiss her, slow and careful as though she were something he could not quite believe was real, she rose to meet him without a moment's hesitation, rain still falling around them and the swollen river rushing past below, and for a long moment neither the danger behind them nor the trial ahead mattered at all. They reached Placerville 2 days later, the town alive with the particular chaos of a place that had grown too fast to ever quite settle, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings, and its hillsides scarred with diggings both abandoned and active, fortunes made and lost within sight of one another. Judge Elias Prout, they learned within an hour of arriving, was not the fair circuit Judge Thomas had promised at all, but a man whose name, when Georgia mentioned it to the newspaper editor she sought out on Wallace's recommendation, drew a bitter laugh. "Prout," said the editor, a wiry man named Abernathy with ink permanently staining his fingers, "sits on the circuit for 3 counties, and in every one of them, cases touching Whitfield interests seem to resolve remarkably in Whitfield's favor. I have written as much twice in this paper, and twice had my press threatened with fire. I stopped writing it a third time when my wife asked me to consider whether the truth was worth our children going hungry if the press burned. George's stomach sank. Then Wallace cannot receive a fair trial here either. Not from Pruitt's bench, no. Abernathy studied Wallace with new interest, having heard the outline of his story with growing disbelief giving way to something like hope. But there is a federal circuit court in Sacramento that hears cases of interstate flight and fraud. And if what you are describing is a pattern of theft across county lines using the mails and freight companies to move stolen goods, that is precisely the sort of case that draws federal interest regardless of what local judges prefer. I have a colleague at the Sacramento Union who has been trying to build exactly such a case against Whitfield's freight operations for a year. He simply lacked proof. It took another full day in Placerville, Georgia treating minor complaints at a boarding house to earn their keep, while Wallace and Hollies met quietly with Abernathy's contacts before they had assembled what they needed. Sworn statements from two former Angels Bend miners, now working claims near Placerville, who remembered Nathaniel Cole's confession fears before his death. A bank clerk willing to testify that Whitfield's mercantile accounts showed irregular deposits matching the pattern of skimmed gold, and Abernathy himself willing to publish the ledger page and its provenance in the next edition of his paper. Time to reach Sacramento before Whitfield could move to suppress it. It was on their last evening in Placerville, in the quiet of the boarding house parlor after Hollies had gone up to bed and Abernathy had left to prepare his printing plates, that Wallace found Georgia sitting alone by a low fire, turning her father's old medical bag over in her hands with an expression he had not seen on her before, something closer to grief than fear. "You are thinking of your father," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I am thinking that he died believing this town was simply unlucky," she said. "Fevers that would not break, harvests that failed 2 years running, a mercantile that always seemed to run short of exactly the medicines a sick child needed most. I used to think God had simply forgotten Larkspur Flat. I did not consider that a man might be manufacturing the bad luck for profit, buying up desperate claims cheap when families could not pay their debts, controlling which supplies arrived and which did not." Her voice caught. "My father might still be alive, Wallace, if the medicine that reached him in his final fever had not been 3 parts filler." Wallace reached over and took her hand without asking permission, and she let him, her fingers curling around his with a desperation that surprised them both. "We cannot undo what he took from either of us," Wallace said quietly. "But we can make certain he does not take anything more from anyone else. That is not nothing, Georgia. That is not a small thing at all." "No," she agreed, wiping her eyes with the back of her free hand and laughing a little at her own tears. "It is not. I did not expect to find myself crying in front of a wanted man in a Placerville parlor when this journey began. I did not expect to find myself falling in love with the physician escorting me to what I feared would be my own hanging," he said, and the words hung between them, plain and unguarded, before he seemed to hear what he had said and went slightly pale. "I apologize. That was not the moment I intended to say that." "Was there a moment you intended?" Georgia asked, her voice unsteady with something between laughter and wonder. "I had imagined something considerably more romantic than a boarding house parlor and a conversation about medicine tampering," he admitted, "involving perhaps wildflowers or, at minimum, not tears." "I find I do not mind the parlor," Georgia said, and closed the distance between them herself this time, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw as she kissed him, slow and certain, everything about the moment saying what her voice had not yet found the courage to say aloud. When they parted, her forehead resting against his, she finally spoke the words plainly. "I love you as well, Wallace Barnett. I did not plan for it either, and I am considerably too practical a woman to have allowed it if I had any say in the matter, but here we are." "Here we are," he agreed softly, and the fire crackled low beside them, and for that one evening at least, the danger waiting outside the boarding house door felt very far away. They rode back toward Larkspur Flat 4 days later with Abernathy's newspaper, freshly printed and folded into Holly's saddlebag, alongside sworn statements and the ledger page itself. Time to arrive the same week as a federal marshal Abernathy's Sacramento colleague had promised to send south to investigate, and it was on the outskirts of Larkspur Flat, within sight of the town itself, that they learned how badly they had underestimated Cyrus Whitfield's willingness to act before that marshal ever arrived. Thomas Bancroft met them on the road, his face gray with exhaustion and something worse. "He knows," Thomas said without preamble, before they had even fully dismounted. "Amos Prout came to me 2 nights past, half out of his mind with fear, saying Whitfield had discovered he'd shown you the mercantile ledgers, Georgia. Whitfield has him locked in a storeroom behind the mercantile, and I do not know if the man is even still alive. And he has called Judge Prout to hold an emergency session tomorrow morning to try Wallace on the spot, in Larkspur Flat, before the marshal or any newspaper article can reach anyone who might interfere." "He cannot simply hold trial wherever he pleases," Georgia said, though even as she spoke she knew that was exactly the kind of thing Cyrus Whitfield had always been able to do, in a county where the judge answered to him, and the sheriff's election had been bought with his money. "He can if the sheriff allows it," Thomas said, his voice breaking with the shame of what he was admitting. "And God help me, Georgia. I have been telling myself for 3 years that taking his money and looking away from small things meant I could still do good where it mattered. I told myself that right up until he threatened to burn this town's mercantile to the ground with Amos Prout inside it if I did not cooperate with tomorrow's proceedings." He looked at his sister, and at the man beside her he had arrested only days before, and something in his face hardened with a resolve that had clearly cost him everything to find. "I am done telling myself that. I do not know what it costs me, but I am done." The trial, if it could be called that, convened the next morning in the largest room Larkspur Flat possessed, which happened to be the Golden Nugget Saloon itself, its gaming tables pushed aside and its bar serving, for once, as nothing but a barrier between the gathered crowd and Judge Elias Prout's borrowed bench. Georgia sat in the front row beside Deputy Holly's, her father's medical bag at her feet out of habit more than necessity, and watched Cyrus Whitfield settle into a chair near the judge with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life feared a courtroom, because he had never once faced one that was not already his. "You are gathered," Judge Prout intoned, "to try the matter of Wallace Barnett, wanted for the murder of Nathaniel Cole in the town of Angel's Bend." "Your Honor," Georgia said, rising before the judge had finished his sentence, drawing gasps from the crowd at her audacity, "I ask the court's indulgence to submit evidence relevant to this matter, evidence obtained in Placerville and confirmed by sworn statement, which speaks directly to the true circumstances of Nathaniel Cole's death." Judge Prout's face darkened. "This is not your courtroom to address, Miss Bancroft." "It is a courtroom in a saloon my family owns, Your Honor," Georgia said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart, "in a town where I have served as the only physician for 3 years, and I would remind the court that a fair trial requires all relevant evidence be heard, regardless of who finds that evidence inconvenient." Whitfield rose, his composure beginning, for the first time, to show hairline cracks. "This is exactly the kind of theatrical nonsense I warned you about, Your Honor. The woman has been in league with the accused for over a week, riding across 2 counties with him unchaperoned. Her testimony is hardly impartial." "No," Wallace said, standing despite Judge Prout's sharp order to remain seated, "but the ledger page is not a matter of impartiality, Whitfield. It is a matter of Nathaniel Cole's own handwriting, dated and initialed, matching precisely the hand in the mercantile ledgers your own clerk has sworn under oath to keeping at your instruction. Numbers do not lie, whatever men in fine coats might wish." It was Thomas Bancroft who moved then, stepping forward from where he had stood near the door throughout the proceedings, and drew from inside his coat a bundle of papers that made Whitfield's face go the color of old ash. "I have here," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, "a signed statement from Amos Prout, taken this very morning after I removed him myself from the storeroom where Cyrus Whitfield had been holding him against his will these past 2 days. Mr. Prout confirms the mercantile ledgers, confirms Nathaniel Cole's prior employment under Whitfield's direction in 2 separate towns, and confirms that he personally overheard Cyrus Whitfield instruct Silas Crane to, and I quote his statement directly, take care of the Assyr problem in Angel's Bend before it becomes my problem in Larkspur Flat as well." The saloon erupted into noise, townsfolk who had gathered more out of curiosity than conviction now murmuring with growing anger as the shape of Whitfield's schemes became visible to them for the first time, laid bare in ledgers and statements, and the plain, damning arithmetic of theft. Cyrus Whitfield's calm finally broke. He lunged not for the door but toward Amos Prout's papers still in Thomas's hand, and in the scramble that followed, Silas Crane, who had been standing near the back of the room with 2 other Whitfield men, drew his pistol, only to find himself facing not 1 lawman but 2, Thomas Bancroft's revolver already leveled at his chest and Hollis's shotgun swinging up beside it, and behind them, unexpectedly, half a dozen townsmen who had grown tired enough of Whitfield's shadow over their lives to reach for whatever weapons they carried without needing to be asked. "Put it down, Crane," Thomas said, his voice hard in a way Georgia had not heard from her brother in years. "It is finished. Whatever he is paying you, it is not worth a rope." Crane's eyes flicked toward Whitfield, seeking some signal, some order, and found only a man frozen in the growing understanding that his money and his reputation had finally run out of road. And slowly, Crane's pistol lowered, then dropped to the saloon floor with a clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Judge Prout, whose own complicity was suddenly rather more exposed than he might have liked, cleared his throat and attempted, with a haste that fooled no one, to reassert some authority over proceedings that had entirely escaped him. "In light of new evidence," he said stiffly, "this court finds insufficient grounds to proceed against the accused, Wallace Barnett, and orders his immediate release, pending further federal investigation into the matters here disclosed." It was not, Georgia thought, watching Cyrus Whitfield led out of his own saloon in irons by her brother, while the town he had controlled for years watched in a silence heavier than any cheer could have been, quite the justice she might have wished for, no dramatic confession, no thunderous denouncement, only a tired, frightened judge saving what remained of his own position by finally telling the truth when the alternative had become impossible to hide. But it was enough. It was, watching Wallace's bound wrists finally cut free by Hollis's own knife, more than enough. The federal marshal arrived from Sacramento 3 days later, exactly as Abernathy's newspaper contact had promised, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals, and a formal warrant for Cyrus Whitfield's arrest on charges of fraud and conspiracy that would, Georgia learned much later, eventually see him convicted, and his considerable holdings across 3 counties broken up and sold, some portion of the proceeds finally returned to the miners and families he had cheated over the better part of a decade. Silas Crane, having no particular loyalty left to protect once his employer's fortune collapsed, gave a full confession in exchange for a lighter sentence, confirming every detail of Nathaniel Cole's murder and clearing Wallace Barnett's name beyond any shadow federal justice cared to leave. It was a bright, cool morning nearly 2 weeks after that saloon trial when Georgia found Wallace standing at the edge of the meadow above Larkspur Flat, where the wildflowers had begun to fade now that spring was tipping toward summer, replaced by taller grass gone gold at its edges. "Your brother tells me the town council met last night," Wallace said as she came to stand beside him, "and voted to offer the position of deputy sheriff to a man who, until 2 weeks ago, carried a $500 bounty on his head. Thomas can be persuasive when he has finally decided to be brave," Georgia said, smiling. He also mentioned that the same council voted to formally recognize Larkspur Flat's need for a permanent physician, with a modest stipend attached, since the town has apparently decided that a woman who accused its most powerful citizen of murder in his own saloon has earned the title she has been doing the work of for 3 years without it. Both excellent developments, Wallace said, though I confess I am more interested in a different piece of news your brother shared with me this morning. Over coffee, he made a point of sharing before I had properly woken, which I took as a somewhat threatening gesture from an older brother. And what news was that? That his sister has never, in the whole of her adult life, allowed a man to court her properly, on account of being too busy setting bones and delivering babies, and running the only respectable saloon between here and Placerville to spare the time for foolishness. Wallace turned to face her fully, and though his voice carried its familiar dry humor, his eyes were serious, and something in them made George's breath catch. I find myself wondering whether a wanted man turned deputy sheriff might have better luck than most, given that he has already survived being shot, ambushed, and put on trial in her company, and finds himself considerably more in love with her now than when this whole business began. Georgia laughed, bright and unguarded, the sound carrying across the meadow. I believe such a man's odds are quite good, Wallace Barnett, particularly since the physician in question has already decided she does not intend to let him ride off toward Sacramento or anywhere else without her. Is that a proposal, Dr. Bancroft? It is an observation of fact, she said, though she was smiling too widely to sound as stern as she intended. Though if you wish to make it something more formal, I would not object to hearing you try. Wallace reached into his coat pocket and withdrew, of all things, the folded ledger page that had started their journey together, now worn soft as cloth from months of handling, and for a moment Georgia thought he meant only to show her some new detail she had missed. I kept this, he said, through a year of running, because it was the only proof I had that the truth mattered more than my own safety. I do not need it any longer to prove my innocence, Georgia, but I find I want to keep it still, because it is the reason I rode into Larkspur Flat bleeding, and because it is the reason I met you. He folded it carefully and tucked it back into his coat, then took both her hands in his. I have no ring to offer you, and no fortune beyond a deputy's salary, and whatever a man saves after a year spent running from bounty hunters. But I have a whole life I would very much like to build here, in this town with you, doing work that matters, in a home we choose together rather than one either of us simply inherited or fell into. Will you have me, Georgia Bancroft, for exactly that and nothing grander than that? There is nothing grander I would want, Georgia said, her voice thick with tears that were, for once, entirely happy ones, and she kissed him there in the meadow above the town, wildflowers fading around them and summer coming on, with the whole bright unclaimed shape of a shared future stretching ahead of them both. They were married a month later, in a ceremony small enough to fit inside the Golden Nugget Saloon during its quiet afternoon hours, Thomas Bancroft standing as witness for his sister, with a pride in his face that had not been there in years, Abernathy having ridden down from Placerville specially to print a small notice of the occasion in his paper, and Amos Prout, recovered from his ordeal and newly appointed as the town's honest mercantile keeper under new ownership, providing flour for a wedding cake that Georgia insisted on testing thoroughly beforehand, to general laughter. Wallace took up his deputy's badge the following week, working alongside Thomas to rebuild a sheriff's office that had spent too long answering to money rather than justice, and Georgia continued her doctoring from a small house behind the saloon that the town council helped fund, treating fevers and broken bones, and increasingly, the ordinary aches of ordinary lives no longer shadowed by a single man's greed. On evenings when the work of the day was done, they would often walk together up to the meadow above town, now thick with summer grass, and sit watching the sun go down gold over the Sierra foothills, Wallace's arm around her shoulders and George's head resting against his chest, Two people who had found, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, exactly the kind of steady, chosen love that neither had quite believed they would be lucky enough to find in a hard and unpredictable land. "I used to think," Georgia said one such evening, watching the light fade over the ridgeline, "that I would spend my whole life alone in that saloon, pouring drinks and setting bones and telling myself it was enough, because wanting more felt like a luxury I could not afford. And now?" Wallace asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Now," she said, smiling up at him, "I have decided that a wanted man with a torn shirt and an honest heart was exactly the luxury I did not know I could afford, until he bled all over my brother's jailhouse floor and gave me no choice but to fall in love with him." "For what it is worth," Wallace said, laughing, "I would bleed on considerably more floors if it meant ending up here again." "Let us hope," Georgia said, "that it does not come to that a second time," and she kissed him as the last light faded from the hills. Home settled around them at last, chosen and certain and entirely their own.